Hello and welcome to the 6th edition of Global Pause Rethink the Future, a podcast that deals with our consumerist way of life and the tactics or the means in order to overcome it. So ultimately what we're focused on our practical actions. We are looking ultimately at the creativity that we can harness in order to see significant change by enabling human action. So in today's episode, we are going to be dealing with exactly that. We're going to be dealing with the sovereignty or the exceptions that we can wield, that we can start the choices that we can start to make in order to see the emergence, or start to make these, I suppose, tactical cuts that lead to a severing of a way of life, and essentially over time will become a model of a way of life and a way of doing business initially, where it will ultimately compete with the entrenched way of doing things. And that ultimately relates to the way how we give and receive. So in this episode, we are going to be charting out the sovereignty that we have as consumers, because, for want of a better way of describing it, our political culture has reduced our agency into buying and selling. And so as we're dealing with an emergent way of life from a market-orientated way of life, that's exactly where the change has to occur. And it ultimately relates to the exception that we can make of an exchange to see change emerge beyond what is accepted as a given. So that's where we're going with this. So how do we understand our sovereignty as far as our consumption goes? So for all intents and purposes, it's considered a situation in an economy where our desires and needs control the output of producers. So when you think of it in that way, the sovereignty is very much circumscribed and is limited in its impact. And so when you're looking at the way how we're going to see an emergence from the given, ultimately that action that is taken for granted as only controlling the means of production has to be really seen in the full light of day, where it can harness or actualise the implicit creativity beyond production, and so implicate the creation of the world at large. So ultimately you're looking at the way how the good that you're orientated towards in your purposeful action can become greater. So that's where we're looking at. So at the moment though, when you're looking at trends in the market, so we're looking at essentially conscious consumption, then there's a few trends that we can look at that are starting to harness that agency, but to a limited degree. But what we'll do is we'll look at the examples and then chart out how they still are very much beholden to, I suppose, the definition that consumers only control the output of producers. So one of the obvious ones when you're looking at is just sustainability. So if you are a person that is now aligning your consumption with your values, and so looking at the ecological pollution or the externalities that haven't been internalised as far as production processes, and so looking at the market and finding goods that you can go buy where sustainability is very much a part of the good, well, you substantiate that good that is now integral to the product, but all it does is it just substantiates the control over the output of those producers. So the agency that you will, or the exception that you make in that regards. And so the exception here, I suppose you could look at it from the aspect of you're making an exception to price or to a narrow understanding of what constitutes self-interest. So looking at how your interest extends beyond the satisfaction of a want to obviously the biosphere of the world at large, as far as the ecological practices and how they impact the world or the earth, and how they persist beyond the satisfaction of your want. But they still are they're limited in scope in the sense that they address the output of producers. Another way of looking at a trend in the market as far as consumer sovereignty goes is looking at the way how businesses or brands can champion causes. So in this scenario, you're looking at, say, a business is, let's look at an example. So an example could be poverty alleviation. So you could say the business is set it up solely to focus on funding projects that removes, that addresses, say, material deprivation. So in that regard, you're orientating your consumption towards that greater good, and you obviously make sustainable the funding model that the business has set up for itself, being a commercial enterprise, in order to champion the cause through the projects it funds. So once again, it's limited in scope in the sense that obviously it substantiates the control of production, because you make that business sustainable, but also it substantiates the good that it can do, but it's circumscribed or is very much a supplement to the business. So it's a supplementary good because it's added on. In that regards, the business is in a dynamic environment, and so maybe what it's doing, it's differentiating itself in the market to give you as a consumer, in inverted commas, more meaning. And so therefore the return that you get in that scenario is obviously greater than your satisfaction of the want, and extends into the way how your decisions are impacting the well-being of other people that are removed from your transaction. So there is a well-being dividend, but it's still limited in scope. And what both of these trends highlight is that there is a sense that they're engaging more of the agency that's latent, but they're ultimately dealing with the symptoms of a way of life and not the cause. So these examples, you could say they're on a spectrum, I suppose, a spectrum of harnessing the creativity. But one of the things that when you're looking at the agency implicit in the exceptions that you can make, now you're making an exception to your narrow self-interest, but what you pass over as a given is your own time as a preeminent good that you're focused on in your life. So one of the things here is that when your agency or the exception that you can wield is very much defined by the limit of the return or the satisfaction of the want, it kind of obliterates the animating power of the exception that very much determines the ground that economics works with, and that defines the extent of obviously the creativity that's latent there. So the disease that is removed, or the satisfaction of the want, you can say no doubt it can justify the position that you as a consumer determine that a production within an economy, but considering that the thing or the good that is said to remove the dis-ease or to remove the uneasiness, so your consumption is ultimately secondary or subordinated to the preeminent good of your time, then it's very limited in scope, these exceptions, because they don't implicate your time as a preeminent good. So what do I mean when I say that they're secondary? So I've touched upon this in the podcast, a couple of podcasts prior, but what that means is that we live in a market-orientated way of life where we have capital equipment, so that means to say that you can go down the street and just buy anything, so you don't have to make it. So that given of time that you save through your consumption, you just don't question it, it's just accepted as it's just accepted as a given. You pass over it. So what that means is that the satisfaction of the want is underwritten by the time that you save by not having to do that. All right, so that's it's just passed over and it's accepted as a given. But that means to say that any satisfaction of a want is always subordinated to the preeminent good of your time. So if it's subordinate or secondary to your time, it's not of value. So when you're looking at the nature of the exception here, if it doesn't implicate your time, the givenness of that time, then you're not looking at the grounds of the world or the grounds of the world that provisions those goods and services. And ultimately, when you're looking at an exception that is fully creative, then you ultimately have to look at that. So it leaves open action that's focused on this good. So, because as the given of our time is the preeminent good and we are orientated towards it, it's never put in play. All right, so it's never given as the grounds to create beyond itself. All right, so the exceptionalism is removed. That exception is removed because we pass over the nature of exchange. And this is when you're making an exception, to make an exception that's truly creative and that obviously throws into relief the relation of want that we have to each other. Ultimately, that's what you're doing. All right, so you are, because you're removing, you're making an exception of the economization of time, because you're giving time the ability for it to manifest what the exception is orientated towards. And ultimately, when you do that, because at the outset, at the moment, you can only address the individualisation of disease, as it were, or the removal of disease. You can't actually address a collective disease, which is our way of life. Because if you think that if everybody, for the most part, is orientated towards their own time, then what kind of world do you share when everybody's orientated towards that? Right, this is the thing. So if everybody's orientated towards their own time and they're securing their time, then the world that they share is very much impoverished for the orientation. You engender consumption as a way of sharing yourself, especially if you are mediated with the models of emulation in the meaning of your existence in order to substantiate the way of life that you've set out for yourself. Because what you're doing is that you're trying to transcend the drudgery of making a living, and the model substantiates the holding pattern that you set in play, because ultimately what you're trying to do is that you're trying to embody the sovereign that has surpassed the holding pattern or the way of life, and so therefore embodies the sovereignty. But because you pass over the exception to create, you can only approximate that sovereignty. You can never actually substantiate it or live it to the degree that you think that you can, because you haven't made an exception that animates creativity where it's needed. So when you're looking at the creativity that's latent within market economies, it's looking at the relation of want satisfaction. Ultimately, you're looking at the way how business and consumers, in inverted commas, relates. So this is where we are focused on when we are looking at the exception of the dynamic good, which is really what we're focused on. So as we're detailing the emergence of a way of life, the emergence of a new way of life ultimately has to do with a way of giving and receiving. All right, that's it's all practical, it's all concrete. To say that, we're emerging to another way of life and you don't crystallise that with the statements of a different way of giving and receiving, well then how do you defining what that new way of life is? So a new way of life is exactly that. It's a new way of giving and receiving. So in order for that to emerge out the way of life that we've accepted for ourselves now, the context is that we are both producer and consumer. So therefore you have to look as a consumer, in inverted commas, you have to look at the way how you receive. As a business, it has to look at the way how it gives. As a producer, or say the labour that you sell, it's the way how you give. And then obviously as a business, it's the way how that they receive. So ultimately, it's both. That's the nexus that needs to be rethought, is the way of giving and receiving. So depending on that, the nature of the exceptions change or are contextualised depending on which side of the fence that you are on in that regard. So depending on where you are. So they're not the same. But what we can do is that we can look within the market at the moment with the trends that I just alluded to prior to see that trend is on a spectrum of harnessing or actualising the agency. But what we're looking at is we're looking at the way how you can surpass the reduction of our agency into buying and selling, and looking at the creativity that's latent there to orientate us beyond the holding pattern of consumerism and relating to each other through wants or through what we buy. Because ultimately the way how we've created a cultural impasse where, because we're orientated towards the preeminent good of our time, the way how we share ourselves is through what we buy. The more that you earn, the more that you buy, you are trying to differentiate yourself. You substantiate consumption as a substitutable activity rather than engendering richer communal experiences where that experience means to say that the nature of the activity just becomes redundant over time. So ultimately, when you're looking at the exceptions that you're going to be make, both as producers and consumers, the nature of those exceptions are the way how the emergence of a way of life or a culture emerges out of the mass market, and how the model of doing business or the model of giving and receiving diverges in order for it to throw into relief where it competes on its merits. So that's where we're going with this. So I think that I'll leave it at that for the moment, so you can understand that where, and the next episode I'm going to be detailing out that in a little bit more detail, and starting to pull it apart depending upon which side of the fence, like I said, we are, whether or not you're a business or a brand, as it were. Because ultimately what we're looking at, because I've touched upon this in the last episode, it's about addressing cynicism. And like I said, if we're looking at the exception that could be made within the market, there's a story of the emergence of this way of life that it's the story of that emergence that has to overcome cynicism. So when you're looking at the exception that you're making, you're going to essentially be addressing cynicism here. And so that's what we're going to be detailing out in the next few episodes. So hopefully stay tuned for that. So thanks and take care.